So today we are discussing the future of cultivated meat, and we are here with Amit Yari, Chief Executive Officer of BioBetter, and Dana Yarden, Managing Director and co-founder of the company. And I am going to discuss with them about the future of cultivated meat and the secret that probably can come from tobacco plants. Hello, Dana. Hi. Hello, Amit. How are you doing?
Doing great, thank you.
How could the secrets to cultivated meat scale up come from tobacco plants? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. One of the major obstacles, the major challenges in the face of the cultivated meat industry is the costs of cell cultivating media. Media costs great sums of money, and specifically the growth factors within it. Every growth media holds several growth factors that are absolutely required for the cells, for their proliferation or their differentiation. And these constitute a major part of this media cost. Now, our company, BioBetter, develops a solution in the form of producing such growth factors in tobacco plants in a way that enables us to manufacture great quantities of these factors in a very low cost.
I just want to ask you how tobacco plants will help in the production of cultivated meat. Is it true that tobacco plants can work as efficient bioreactors?
Yes, they do. Tobacco plants can manufacture a great number of complex proteins that require post-translational modification. That is specific changes that can only be performed by advanced organisms, multicellular organisms or eukaryotic organisms. I don't want to use too much technical terms, but those are changes that can only be performed by advanced organisms. And they cannot be performed by simple fermentation vectors. That is, you know that proteins today, not proteins for food application, but proteins that have a function, such as enzymes and growth factors, are mostly produced by fermentation systems, mostly bacteria or yeast. These are the simpler systems that can produce high volumes of proteins at low costs. But they have their limitations, because they cannot perform these post-translational modifications that are required for the function of some proteins. It just happens to be that growth factors, or at least a big part of them, require post-translational modifications for their correct functions. And these cannot be simply and cheaply produced by these simpler fermentation systems. So this is what the tobacco plant brings. Tobacco plant is, of course, a eukaryote. It's a relatively advanced organism, and in many ways, the proteins it produces are similar to mammalian proteins, and it can effectively produce them. Now, the advantage of using tobacco plant as a vector is it can be grown at very large scale at a very low cost when we compare it to using fermentation systems, complex fermentation systems. For example, to grow tobacco plant, you only need a field and somebody to take care of the plants, a farmer. And this doesn't take a large investment. But if you would like to produce proteins by fermentation, you have to build a very costly, very expensive and large facility and invest in infrastructure, in bioreactors, in sterile environments, and so on. So this is what is called the capex, the investment you have to make before you can start producing. And of course, the cost of the process itself, of the production, the raw materials, and the energy it takes, the people, everything is much more expensive when working in fermentation when compared to using plants as bioreactors. And what I mean when I say using plants as bioreactors is simply introducing into the plant the DNA that is required for production of the proteins that we want to produce. And the plants grow by themselves in the field. They just require water, a little fertilizer. They use renewable energy from the sun. They build themselves, they grow, they develop, they manufacture the proteins that we want to manufacture. They maintain sterility within their cells. They maintain homeostasis, that is constant condition for the protein, and they keep the proteins inside them until we are ready to harvest.
Some people might wonder why tobacco and not any other plant that can be used during this process. Is it something that you have tried, in your company only with tobacco plants, or have you tried other plants as well?
In our company, we're working with tobacco plants, a specific type of tobacco plants, larger. The exact name is Nicotiana tabacum, which is relatively large plant. It grows to heights of about 2.5 meters. It builds a very large biomass, kilogram and a half sometimes, and it grows fast. And these are all advantages when you want to grow large biomass or large quantities of material. It can be grown up to 4 cycles per year, which is also an advantage compared to other crops that can only be grown 1 cycle a year. Tobacco has actually been used for protein expression, recombinant protein expression, for many years. Usually, they use a smaller version of the tobacco. It's a different species, actually. It's called Nicotiana bentamiana, which is much smaller and comfortable to work in the lab. Perhaps it started as a model organism because it was very easy to transform it with DNA and make it produce protein. As I said, it's small, it's easy to grow in the laboratory and work with. So maybe that's why it started. But as I mentioned, work on tobacco plants started many years ago, and they were found to be an efficient vector, which is easy to work with and can produce many types of different proteins from mammalian or from other sources. Actually, there are several companies that work on producing recombinant proteins in tobacco plants, but mostly for medical application. What we do in BioBetter is to change the concept a little and not aim for medical application, which requires usually very small amounts of protein that can be eventually sold at very high prices, but to modify, to use this tobacco vector in a way that is more suitable for large production scale in open fields and grow large plants with big biomass and is suitable for production, what will eventually have to be a commodity in terms of cost and of production volume.
In terms of the feedback that you get from the sector, are there many companies that they have already been interested in the solution that you offer?
Yeah, there is a great interest from companies that understand the need. They understand that currently, when not many companies are already in production, but most of them are starting or building their pilot facilities and manufacture only several kilograms per year, the cost of media is not a big factor. But in the future, hopefully, we will be in a position where a large percentage of the world meat consumption will be cultivated meat, and great volume, many millions of tons of meat will be produced. And they understand that they have to aim for production of this scale. And when producing in such a scale, they'll have to buy their growth factor as cheaply as possible because every cent will count. And that's the sort of interest, and they are very interested in our solution and want to try our factors. In fact, we have already delivered samples to several companies with successful results.
Which are the benefits and drawbacks of lab-grown meat?
Well, at least in my opinion, cultivated meat is inevitable. The world population constantly grows and expands, and people, at least in many countries, are becoming richer, and they require a diet that contains more meat, or at least they want to eat more meat. And according to extrapolation of today's growing methods, within a few decades, current agriculture will not be able to support the requirement for meat, for chicken, perhaps even for milk. And that's without even mentioning the damages that such technologies do to the environment, mainly in the form of greenhouse gases release, of growing areas, of cutting wild vegetation and jungles and so on, clearing land for growing the animals, but also the grains that these animals consume and the water that's required. What I'm trying to get at is that current meat growing methods are not sustainable. And there is a rather consensus, large consensus about the need to replace them with more efficient methods. Now, of course, one can claim that there are many meat replacements. Some of them are very, very good, and that's true. But those are a replacement. And the cultivated meat industry aims at making the real thing, meat that is identical, hopefully in every aspect of its nutritious values, of its taste, everything, to what is now produced by animal slaughter. I think that the transfer to this is inevitable, and it depends on how quickly we can develop the technologies to produce it in economically viable ways.